At least you can kind of see, make sure this is working for me by being up here. Okay. So last time, you remember Genesis 9 started with a lot of words from God, comforting, instructing about animals taking life. Man, don't take life, and I'm not going to send a flood anymore. And I'm establishing a covenant with you, and I'm putting a symbol in the sky that is a rainbow. So then we walked through that. And then later in chapter 9, we went to a spiritual sad story, just like we had with, Cain and Abel, a spiritual sad story that's highlighted for a reason to show hearts that are still sinful and leave God. Noah got drunk, and Ham did what?
Check him out.
Ham thought and didn't and did it in a way to share and not honor, but rather kind of promote the dishonor of what had happened. And by contrast, Shem and Japheth responded in what way?
Covered them up.
Yeah, even walk. I mean, this is amazing respect. If you'd say, what an idea! It's one thing to walk in with a blanket. I'm going to cover you, and with my eyes forward. It's another thing to come up with a plan to not even look on their father's nakedness. So it's very, very spiritually diverse story with the way Ham approached it, and then the respect of the other brothers. And after that, we closed out chapter 9. I've got too many of the wrong books in the wrong place.
Noah lived 950 years.
Yeah, we finished off the record of Noah's life. And if you remember, that was the third, this is the account of Noah. That was the third account that we had for the Toledot, the histories, the many histories throughout Genesis. That finishes number 3. At the start of chapter 10, we begin a new one with, this is the account of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's sons, who themselves had sons after the flood. So this chapter is titled The Table of Nations, and it comes in 3 groups. And I already kind of listed them out down here, noting that we started with Cain's descendants before we did Seth's earlier in Genesis chapter 5. And then following kind of the same mold, Moses is, I think, saving the family of the promise for the last oomph-pa. And he's going to do that again in other places later on in Genesis that we'll see, where the family of the promise is referenced last.
But just a second here.
Mm-hmm.
Who carved out Israel? How did Israel come to be Israel?
So yeah, Israel is the name after Jacob gets his name changed, right? So when that happens, they are known then as the Israelites, but it's out of that mini family tree of Abraham to call them Israelites and as a nation. So we're in a really interesting part of history, because Genesis 12, what are we? Chapter 10. Genesis 12 is going to zoom in after setting the table of all these peoples. Genesis 12 is going to zoom in on Terah and his son Abraham, and the call of Abraham, I will make you into a great nation. And Abraham, Isaac, Jacob with the 12 sons that are names for the 12 tribes of Israelites after they spend a hiatus in exile, or in Egypt, right? In slavery. So that Genesis ends with Joseph, one of the sons of Jacob, and Joseph being in Egypt in a successful way, but the people over time become enslaved, says the start of Exodus, right? So that's really the origin of the Israelites who then come out as millions They go into Egypt as a group of 70. They come out in the millions, with all that time in between, 350 years. And then they come out of Egypt under Moses and are brought into the conquest of the Canaanite region with names of peoples you're going to see in Genesis 10. So this is good to do the big picture, because that's exactly what Moses wants you to do. He's giving you little nuggets and carrots of what's coming. You're going to see Babel and Babylon and Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, and the capital of the Babylonian Empire, already mentioned in Genesis 10. It's like, here you go, right? It's already, it's almost like a prelude to these big empires and things that would come long after Moses lives. So it's pretty bonkers that such a wide world is put in front of us, and God's dealings with that world and his saving activity is all spelled out through the rest of the Old Testament. Big world. 3 sons starts there. Suzanne.
Could I have a handout?
Oh, did you? Yes.
Makes me find post office.
Yeah, and I need to put this up. I've got this for, see if I can share this. I wanted people who are watching this, let's see, present. Where's my screen share? Present something.
God promised Moses a promised land. I'm told of the promised land. Isn't this area that's Israel the promised land?
The promised land, yes, is going to be in this area of Canaan, and God kind of draws the boundaries. And it's interesting that it's very similar to the boundaries you're going to see drawn for the descendants of Ham. So
Inside of Israel.
Yeah.
What's drawn for Israel, and that's inside of.
yeah, and if you remember what they did when they conquest, they didn't do a very good job inheriting the promised land and driving out the peoples, right? So they, in terms of borders, the heyday happens. You probably have maps, or maybe I can show you some maps of the promised land under David and the promised land under Solomon, and see how far the borders got. And it was only briefly that the borders were secured as much as they were before things break apart and break down.
Promised land under I can't pronounce it.
Yeah. Well, because Israel was under the British rule from 1918 to 1948 was Palestine.
Just until after the
Was
Second
Just
World
after
War.
the First World War.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, but
I'm gonna pull-
England drew the borders.
Yes,
In
England
that-
but
in that
then
part of the
they
world.
needed a place for the Jews to come back to
Right.
be safe. So then that's when this modern Israel gets started.
Right. Yeah, you're right.
I think
Technically.
Gaza.
But England did that.
Yeah,
For thousands of years.
Well.
Okay.
England might have been here from the US.
Yeah, the Palestinians that did Gaza.
One
Well, maybe some of them were living in Israel at the time and they go,
You just have to move over there.
They got the good
Well,
land.
they started fighting right away too. They
Yeah.
started, attacking the Jews. So then, yeah, they gave them their own space to be.
Yeah.
They built a wall of people trying to help them.
Probably a good thing to do is go to the library and get the history of Palestine and the history of Israel.
And yeah.
See
You
how
can
that
look it up
works.
on your phone.
Well, with the Bible
Another
as
reading
a
book.
Yes.
pretty good history book in front of you right
Yeah.
here. So we'll kind of see some early origins. In fact, I mean, you could say some of what the Bible says, even in this chapter, is deeper, a more ancient history than than any other resource on the planet, any other written down records. It goes further back. If we're really going back to the Ark and Shem, Ham, and Japheth, there's nothing else written that does the same thing for the origins of these nations. So, Barbara?
All the Old Testament references about Israel coming back to the promised land after, refer to the return after the Babylonian captivity,
Uh-huh.
and also
Wandering
the
in the wilderness.
return to the promised land also is a reference to the New Testament era where all of us will reach, all believers will reach heaven, or the unity of the Christian church.
Yeah.
I was listening to two Catholics discuss this, because they said, we've got this faction now of people who think that you have to have Jerusalem in order to have the apocalypse come and,
Yeah.
and the kingdom
Catholics?
come. And he said, but no, the Catholics
Oh.
don't. They were talking about how this is,
Yeah.
but it's never been a Christian principle
Mm-mm.
Yeah, that's.
until like in the, 20s or something, then they started.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's correct. That is not something we hold to
Yeah.
regarding Jerusalem and its
I
future.
went to these volumes. I have what Luther says about the Jews. There's a whole section on Jews,
Yeah.
and he seems to think that it's really reference to the return from the exile
Mm.
and keeping the nation together until Jesus came.
Yeah.
Yeah. Suzanne, did you have?
Oh, quick question. Japheth kind of caught my eye when he went north and east.
Yeah.
Could we say the European nations that were descendants of Japheth?
Yeah. As far as spreading out, this is the territory that he's reaching into. And I've got the commentary out because it mentions a lot of different passages, and we can go through that and see what it says. So we're at Genesis chapter 10, and for people watching the YouTube, there's a map up here, and you see the little key to the map at the bottom. But it lets you know descendants of Shem, at least with some confidence of where they're situated, are indicated in circled names, and that'll come at the end of our study today. The first one's is Japheth, which is not circled and it's not boxed, towards the north up by the Black Sea. You see more of those. And then Ham in the middle with the box where you have like Canaan and Egypt, Ethiopian area, Libya by the North African section. So we're looking at that map kind of as we go through this chapter together, which begins our fourth mini history, or Toledot. This is the account of Toledot is the word for account there. So we're in our fourth account labeled to start chapter 10. Michael?
Okay, the Japheth in here, the first one's gonna be Japhethite, right?
Yeah, does it say that?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Then the second one is for Ham, and that's Hammonites.
Hamites.
So the third one is for Shem, but they're Seminites. How come they're not Sheminites?
Well, it just kind of loses the, you've got you've got the same symbol. I don't know if this is totally the reason why as
They dropped the
we
H.
transliterate things, but this is the difference in Hebrew between SH and S.
Oh my gosh.
It's just where the dot goes.
Well, maybe they put the dot in the wrong
No.
place.
Well, I think it's kind of like, some that become, when you think of Semitic languages or whatnot. Yeah, so it's,
After all your years of education, you have all these names of sons memorized. So if I asked you, tell me the sons of Gomer, you know that.
hold on. No,
Okay.
The dots?
I think there's 70 names in here, and I'm still working on 70 names for kids in our church or something. So
Oh, no.
just kidding. Go ahead, Suzanne.
At the end of Revelation, it says, don't change a dot or a tittle. Well, that's changing the
Yeah.
dot.
Yeah.
I think it really all it is a matter of how you would transliterate something and bringing it into another language. What stuck and what didn't stick for the pronunciation of things. So when things become turned into Latin, for example, is it going to keep an H sound or a rough sound or not and just get lost instead of saying Shemites being Semites and Semitic? the Semitic. You've heard of that, right? I mean, ancient Near East and the Semitic languages and things like that, language development, which of course I should point out, Genesis 10, I know we haven't read anything yet, but as we're doing this, Moses knows that he's going to be rewinding some to tell you about Babel and the tower, because he's going to have a phrase in this chapter that says that they had their different languages. So built into this chapter 10 is going to show you them spreading out. And one of the reasons for extra spreading out was the confusion of languages at the Tower of Babel. So we'll get there. Well, let's read a little bit. We have our introduction to this new Toledot, this new history, this new account. This is the account of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's sons, whom themselves had sons after the flood. Beginning with the Japhethites. Some say we'd start with the sons of Japheth because of the fact that they are the most remote from the rest of God's salvation history as it's recorded, because obviously the Hamites and Canaanites are going to be the ones displaced in the promised land and driven out, and what happens in Egypt is all going to relate to Ham. So it could be one reason for starting there with Japheth and then doing Ham and kind of zooming in, and then you do even more so on the line of the promise through Shem. Well, let me just read these and we'll see what Moses bothers to tell us. The sons of Japheth: Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tiras. If you look at your map, then you see the Ionians are of Javan, way on the upper left corner, Javan over there in Greece. The Ionian nation, which became the Greeks, is coming from Javan. So that one's mentioned. You have Meshech in there and occupying northern Asia Minor, along with Magog, likely around the Black Sea. Some of these are modest guesses. Gomer also along the top, between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, listed in there. Tubal, Madai, south of the Caspian Sea, and Tiras is that arrow way on the far left in the Mediterranean Sea, because
Spread out.
yeah, spread out. Mm-hmm.
Maybe Spain.
Yeah. So some of the sources of help with this table of nations would be historians that have written over the years. Josephus being a historian, or Jerome or Eusebius. You've got different people with records of nations and trying to look up these peoples and trace them. So there are some references to that. And other ancient literature that comes out of this. So Tiras is usually identified with either the Thracians, an ancient pirate nation that tyrannized shipping in the Aegean Sea, or with later Etruscans of Italy. So that's why Tiras is off the map if you associate with Italy, way over there.
Who was the one that directed them to go to these specific places?
Nobody did. They're not under direction, besides the fact that God had said in chapter 9, be fruitful, go and fill the earth, go and spread out. And you have Babel being the problem. It was because it was such defiant display of human glory against the word of God to spread out and fill the earth, to say, let's stay here and build a city and make a name for ourselves rather than doing the God thing. So nobody's necessarily dictating, you go here, you go there. It's just happening. And Moses is giving us an opportunity to identify what happened as these nations get settled, as these descendants are born and move around. So out of the sons of Gomer, you have Ashkenaz, Riphath, and Togarmah. Aren't you glad I'm reading today?
Yes, I am.
Don, you're next, you know.
I
the-
don't know.
Um, Ashkenaz, from their home in Asia Minor, is referred to as probable Indo-Europeans that later migrated to Germany. Jewish tradition identifies the descendants of Ashkenaz with Germans. Riphath, as unidentified, Josephus puts that people in Asia Minor near the Black Sea. Togarmah, in later Hebrew, that's the name for Turkey. So, I mean, I don't have the time or the wherewithal at this point to have done all this myself. I'm borrowing from the commentary and others' research to kind of put this in front of you today, but to kind of see these regions and what scholars do as they try to work through the history of these peoples. All right, the sons of Javan, remember we said that'd be the Ionians and the Greeks eventually. You have Elisha, Tarshish, and Kittim, and the Rodanim. From these, the maritime people spread out into their territories by their clans within their nations, each with its own language. There's something to see there, unrelated to this, in that Moses writes 4 characteristics in that phrase. Maritime people spreading out. It's by clan. What's the next one? Territory. It mentions territory,
Nations.
nation, and language. So as far as framing this and what he's contributing to you, your background and knowledge, Moses is highlighting this, that by clans and territories, nation and language, that you'd have distinctions made geographically and ethnically with clans, politically as far as nation interrelation, and then language, what they speak, being divided up. So he's giving you four ways. I don't think that's the only time that comes up. If you look ahead, just to cheat, in verse 20, notice how he wraps it up the same way. These are the sons of Ham by their clans and their language, by their territories and their nations. That's Moses is working hard to set up this ancient Near Eastern population according to these kinds of ways of thinking. He's helping you recognize not just a son, but a clan and a nation and a location and a language that's being developed and used as these people spread out. Merlin.
Where is Moses at this time?
So Moses, of course, he's writing the first 5 books of the Bible all at once after the time of Exodus. Deuteronomy brings out, like, Moses write all of this down, Moses write all of this down. And so you have him making a record as he's with the people before his death, making a record of Genesis through Deuteronomy. And, you know, he dies on a mountain overlooking the promised land without being able to enter because of his sin.
Right.
So Moses, that's where Moses is at. Moses has been wandering with the people through the desert and is on the doorstep of the promised land. And we have the first 5 books of the Bible from him.
But this all takes place like
The Pentateuch, right. So he's writing and by the Holy Spirit, especially with Genesis and history, and you think of the oral history and tradition they would have passed down, and maybe this is something that he's inherited, is this is the account of, and somebody has told this story before and emphasized this promise. Do you know what Ham did with his dad and how perverse that was? Do you know what Cain did to his brother? And this big, spiritual story of the differences, what was going on in their hearts. So histories, right? And now I've got 10 I can memorize, and there's a book. And then he can tell the story of Exodus. He lived that one, right? So very interesting to have the Holy Spirit do all this through Moses for the people to have their eyes on their lives of faith under the Lord, and to also see their setting among the people. Where do we fit and why?
They were always looking forward to the promise though too, so they knew it had to come from somebody, and so they had to keep track
Yeah,
of all these people.
they're entirely invested in this line. Let's circle it, right? Entirely invested in what God is going to do by the promise to Adam and Eve that is still hopefully ringing in their ears, and their hope of being saved.
At this time, they weren't called Jews. Is it Moses' time that they started to be calling Jews?
Yeah, and you get like Jew out of this Judaioi, I think, Greek name. So, Greek becomes what we call the lingua franca, right? We still call it the lingua franca, like the widespread language of the time. And with the Greek Empire, they're speaking kind of Greek on the street and Hebrew, with the Roman language and Latin taking over at some point in Jesus' day. So when you have the split after King Solomon between Rehoboam and Jeroboam and north and south, the south is really just Judah. And so then you get these Judeans and the Judaioi, and that's where you get what we then morphs into our English usage of that people being the Jews.
So is that where Judeo comes from?
Yeah.
Right there.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Judea, think Judah. Yep. The line of David through the Savior born in Bethlehem. And out of you in the land of Judah, right? So though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origin is from of old, from ancient times, coming to a month near you.
Yes.
Very soon.
Was that Micah?
Yeah. Mhm.
Micah?
You, Bethlehem Ephratah, Micah 5. Let's see. Anything else there? I can read these notes because I think they're interesting. The Tarshish is mentioned. The sons of the Greek peoples. Name is identified with localities in Sardinia and also with Tartessus in eastern Spain. The Kittim are the inhabitants of Greek coastal areas, possibly Cyprus. And the Rhodaneme, a reference would probably be inhabitants of the island of Rhodes in the Aegean Sea. Interesting, huh? Yeah. All these peoples.
Where is the Aegean Sea?
That's what I just asked.
Right.
Yeah.
That's
Italy, I was just gonna look
between
exactly
Greece
what it's
and
now.
Italy, right?
Yeah, the boot of Italy, and then you've got Greece, and you've got an Ionian Sea in between, and the Aegean Sea is on your map.
Up there.
The Aegean Sea is this one here.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's, Macedonia is kind of this northern arc. You have, I guess, like main part of Greece, that western peninsula thing that comes down with Athens and Corinth down at towards the south. Athens and then Corinth is a coastal city. So Ephesus, this is Asia Minor, Ephesus being over here. I'm sorry that is so dimmed. I don't
So
know.
it's part of the Mediterranean, I guess. It's just a northern.
There we go.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is Asia Minor. You think of the mission journeys. This is Cyprus here, and Crete, and then other islands, Rhodes and stuff is up in there. Not Rhodes, maybe down here. So it's talking about these maritime peoples, right? And Japheth. So we're kind of going north with Japheth, west with Japheth, and into these other areas. Coming off the big boat, the big box. How about the descendants of Ham? Verse 6, the sons of Ham, Cush, Mitzrayim, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. the sons of Cush, and then I'll think of Cush down along the Red Sea, some probably on the western side and some others in the Arabian desert on the eastern side of the Red Sea for Seba, Havilah, Sabta, Ra'amah, and Sabteka. And then the sons of Ra'amah, Sheba, and Dedan. And then we pause after talking about these peoples that are settling. There's a big story here. Cush was the father of Nimrod. Interesting that Nimrod obviously isn't even in verse 7, where sons of Cush are mentioned, and you've got another one or some descendant that is prominent, and Moses tells us a little bit about this guy. Nimrod grew to be a mighty warrior on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That is why it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. So there's an expression, like Moses is quoting something people would have heard, like a saying passed down as a comparison, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The first centers of his kingdom were Babylon, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in Shinar. Now you see where Shinar is. So this is a future descendant of Cush who leads a group out of where you see Cush at the bottom, and they take over conquest peoples and live in between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers in Shinar. So they're moving out of this and occupying this land. And notice this is where you get these names of these huge capital cities. Babylon being the one first in that list, and from that land he went to Assyria, where he built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Ir, Calah, and Rezin, which is between Nineveh and Calah. That is the great city. So these are ancient cities and places. Some of them are easier to identify than others, and Babel and Babylon are likely like really close to each other location wise. Making a name for himself.
Oh, yeah.
So Nineveh is the Assyrian capital, right? The Assyrian powerhouse. You think of the book of Jonah, go to the city of Nineveh and preach to the Ninevites, right? And he didn't want to because they were the enemies. They were plundering the northern tribes of Israel. So they were the enemies to the north, but they were defeated, by the coming of the Babylonian Empire. And then the Medes and the Persians take over the Babylonians, and then the Greeks take them over, and then the Romans. So you have your cycle of empires, but the Assyrians being mentioned with their capital city, that's all this northern area here, Nineveh and Babylon. So we're talking about these Cushites and Nimrod coming out of the sons of Cush and settling and taking over by force some of these areas, making a name for himself that way, establishing huge cities.
Wasn't the king of Babylon Christian? No,
Well,
not Babylon. Later on.
I mean,
Corinth.
you do have Nineveh's story of repentance. You have Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar is humbled, right? And
But I mean, historically, it seemed like there was one king.
Cyrus
Conquered.
lets
He
them
was
go.
a young king that conquered a lot of that area.
Mm,
Anyway,
mm-hmm.
it was it's later history.
Okay. Yeah.
But there was some Christianity for a while there.
Okay.
He just reigned for a short time. He was just in his 30s.
You're talking like Constantine?
Constant, that's
Okay,
it. That's it.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's much later.
Yeah.
So there was Christianity in that area then.
It's a couple centuries after Jesus. Yeah. That's after Jesus. Yeah, like 400 AD.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Michael.
Answer that.
I wonder why Put's generation is not listed in here.
Mhm.
He wasn't
It's
worth
just-
it.
I guess.
He didn't do anything.
Yeah,
Well, he's over there in the Sahara Desert.
Yes, or
Nobody wanted to go
Yeah,
over
he
there,
off,
so
but
they wanted to-
He's all alone.
But, well, of course, if he lived close enough to the Mediterranean. System. But what I mean.
Somewhere in the Old Testament, it refers to the great men of old. Would this Nimrod be one of those great men of old?
yeah, we had the men of renown pre-flood. If you remember, that phrase was in Genesis 6.
Okay.
And then they, you know, the
Yeah.
reputation for being great and what was great. Obviously, that idea is supposed to die in the flood. And then you remember what greatness is a life with the Lord, you know, and it's lost again. Now you have a Nimrod with a name for himself and building cities and developing an empire by force, kind of this mighty hunter who's establishing a kingdom. So a conqueror.
So the great men of old before the flood were those who believed. Or
When we're told about them, we're told about that right after the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and the sons of God doesn't mean angels there, but likely believers who have lost, the salt has lost its saltiness, and they are after secular passions and desires and beauty ahead of faith issues. And that they're the ones who are the people called the Nephilim, and these great heroes of old. That's when it's mentioned.
Oh, okay.
So it's kind of it's a loss, you could say, spiritually speaking, that's at work. An emphasis on earthly wealth, prosperity, and pleasure that takes over as the background for the coming of the flood and God's justice against that wickedness and rebellion as he
So
grieves.
they would be the ones who were concerned with greatness.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
Michael.
Well, today the Nimrod's not so good.
Yeah. Yeah, Nimrod.
Yeah, it shows if the first one is a hunter, which goes with this. Then it says a person regarded as silly, foolish, stupid, an idiot.
Yeah.
How do they get that out of being a hunter? I don't understand.
I don't know either. I mean, it's not necessarily related. How you have to look at the history of that use of Nimrod and when people started to use that as a term for a fool.
Which doesn't make sense. If you're a mighty hunter, I would figure if you're gonna elaborate on that, it would be something in that region.
Well, I mean, if we're Christians and we're saying you're a fool if you think your great name means something, then I could see that happening. I don't know.
Suppose.
Less the hunter and more your reputation over against God's reputation.
Why did Moses call him before the Lord?
That's an interesting phrase because it's either to say, you could say before the Lord, that he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. So is that saying that I'm aware that he's doing this kind of like the story of Babel is going to flesh out, that God sees, God knows, and his spirit confuses their language. So it's not happening unbeknownst to God. Doesn't seem like his little crusade out of the area of Cush to come up here. I don't think you'd say, is Moses trying to tell us that God told him to do it and to go conquer that area and establish those cities that had happened before the Lord? Some sense has to be at work there, but it's hard to say what for sure. Merlin.
Pastor, we look at, for example, the three great religions,
Uh-huh.
okay? And one of them being Muslim. Did Muslims come out of any of these sons? Or
Well-
where did they come from?
I mean, because you could always say everybody comes from one of these three sons.
Okay.
But so that's a starting point. But the Muslim religion itself and Muhammad, the prophet, that is that develops after Jesus' day,
Like 600
you know,
years.
Yeah,
and you
there's a
have,
tree, I know that.
yeah, and you know, you've got the pilgrimages and the things that he works into religion. Wasn't he like in Egypt or something? The origin story for Islam. So that develops later, definitely develops later, but it explodes, right? Explodes with followers, and even by Luther's day, you could talk about them and their religion.
Yeah.
Yeah. Lots going on here. It's hard to put it all together. Not easy, but at the same time, you can see a purpose and intent for us to have some wherewithal when it comes to these peoples and settling and the future history that would come from it. Anything else there? Although we don't know, this commentary says, we don't know where the Casluhites settled, but we learn that the Philistines descended from them. From secular history from 12th century BC, we know that there were Assi peoples that came in from Asia Minor after destroying the Hittite Empire and occupied Crete, which could be like Captor in Hebrew, established a foothold then in Egypt. And once driven out of Egypt, they settled on the southwest coast of Canaan. So that could be the story of the Philistines, these sea peoples that take over the Hittites and occupy Crete, even get to Egypt, but eventually land in the Philistine area of Philistia. That's the backstory in the commentary anyway. Interesting, huh?
So the Muslims started in Mecca in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah. And that's much,
But
much
he was
later.
very influenced by the Bible. He took a lot of stuff from there and then perverted it.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's
Came
because
up
he
with
wanted
the-
his virgins in there.
The 5 pillars
Is it like-
of Islam.
Yeah.
If you look at verse 15, you get into a lot of the, I don't know if they're clans or nation names that are mentioned later on for settling in the promised land, like Jebusites. So Canaan is the father of Sidon, his firstborn, and of the Hittites, Jebusites, Amorites, Girgashites, Hivites, Arkites, Sinites, Arvadites, Zemarites, and Hamathites. Now I know Jebusites, Amorites, Girgashites, Hivites, and maybe one other was repeated later by Moses for the territory of go into the promised land, and these are the places you will displace, right? So we're looking at territories and peoples that are identifiable descendants of Canaan in that section. And then he draws a little bit of a map, and I don't know if I'm gonna be able to do it. But he does draw a little bit of a map for the territory of the Canaanites. Later, he says the Canaanite clans scattered, and the borders of Canaan reached from Sidon, and that's the name from his firstborn, toward Gerar and as far as Gaza, and then toward Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim, as far as Lasha. Some of these places are more familiar, and some of them are less familiar. So when you have this, Mediterranean Sea, and let's just do the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee, Sodom and Gomorrah are likely, little coastal spots on the Dead Sea, right? But what this is painting is Sidon. You could kind of remember Tyre and Sidon are these north, like where the Hittites would settle. Tyre and Sidon are these Phoenician, coastal cities that are known. So there could be a starting point up here to go this way. And then work your way down towards Gerar as far as Gaza. Now we're down into the, if this is the Nile Delta and the Nile, and you've got the fingers of the, I am not drawing a very good map, of the Red Sea. I think you have Gerar is like in this Sinai Peninsula down here. You know how we often will mark like Beersheba, the Well of Seven later on gets marked down in the southern area. And so we're kind of outlining, what I'm getting at is we're outlining a territory like this. Do you see that? He's doing that with these descendants of Canaan. And he's saying later they began to settle with borders. They reach from Sidon down to Gerar as far south as Gaza, and then toward Sodom, right, and Gomorrah. So if you're thinking of how far inland, it seems like the Sea of Galilee, the Dead Sea, is like this border, and these would be the Canaanite peoples. Something like that. That's all I got for you.
Trying to match that to the map.
Right? And because eventually we're going to have this region displaced with 12 tribes, right? Under, being mentioned again, borders being mentioned again with the conquest of the promised land. And what God is going to say to Abraham as he draws a map for Abraham, this is where I want you to occupy and live. It's going to take and displace. So when we heard, cursed be Canaan, he'll be slave, and now we're drawing borders here, and this is also going to serve as the same rough outline for the promised land. Let's see. If you want to hold your finger and look at Genesis chapter 15, at the very end of that chapter, to your descendants I give this land from the great river of Egypt to the great river the Euphrates. Now I know if you can look at this map, you see that the Euphrates, this is a northern territory. He's giving boundaries from the great river Euphrates to the great river Egypt. Look what's in the middle of that is Canaan, right? Is your box Canaan. And then he even says it's the land of Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, but we have Hittites mentioned there, and Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. Those are all same thing God's saying to Abram that Moses is listing in his table of nations here in chapter 10. All these peoples. So we're drawing our lines, and that is the vision that God puts for Abram for where they would come back and settle someday, is giving them this Euphrates to Egypt and region that they're settling in.
So if Israel had obeyed God and driven out the heathen nations totally, they may have had all of that territory.
Yeah.
Wasn't the biggest boundary of the Holy Land during David's time or Solomon?
One of the two. I'd have to I could only research so much in prepping this paper. But you're right. I know. I wish it weren't so fuzzy, but there is one of those two is kind of where the boundaries reach their maximum point, probably by the end of the reign of King David, I think, in the time of Solomon. If you remember, King David he's the war king, right?
Yeah.
And Solomon is the era of peace with the temple building project. So King David has the Philistines who are bugging him and other peoples that are attacking God's people at that time. So they're still there. They kind of have battles on a lot of different fronts.
At least they made peace and alliances with a lot of these nations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Sometimes they're looking to Egypt for help. Sometimes they're looking elsewhere for help. And oftentimes they're not looking to God for help. And God calls them out and says, why do you keep looking to Egypt and human power? And you're forgetting the God who birthed you and made you what you are. It's by my promise that you are what you are. My grace, my mercy. It's not the strength in your bicep and the sword at your side. How about that? Michael?
I just drew up a picture of map of ancient Israel, and it looks like where Palestine is now.
Yeah.
It used to be called Philistia.
Yeah.
Right.
Which
So
is,
that came from the Philistines.
yeah,
I guess
exactly.
Israel didn't go in there and take that land over like it was supposed to.
Yep. Yep. And you should always think of the connection between Philistia and Palestine. They are linguistic relatives. So when you think of Philistia and Palestine, Palestine is it's an adaptation. You've lost the H, but you know, whatever
Right.
language transfer is going on here, somebody else can tell you that story, but not me. Philistia and Palestine, however, are linguistically related terms, and you can even see it lining up that way.
So the problem we have today is because what they didn't do back then, what they were supposed to do.
Yeah, and you have this, like, you know, animosity that is stuck there,
Yeah,
right?
right.
And the tensions that don't seem like they'll ever resolve as they make religious claims, you know, for Jerusalem and things like that.
I think you said Cush went up to the Euphrates area.
Yeah, when we heard
I'm sure
about
they
Nim,
just didn't walk in and go hi. They probably had a battle their way in.
exactly, and I think that's why this whole mighty hunter idea, this commentary suggests that sense is less like hunting wild animals and more just a forceful way he pushed and settled in new territory.
Had a good army.
And suggesting that Nimrod could be the one who spearheads the whole Tower of Babel movement, though I don't think that's named in the Tower of Babel. So the idea of moving up there. Well, should we get to verse 21? We have some time. Yeah. Sons were also born to Shem, whose older brother was Japheth. So I'm mentioning Shem later, Moses says, but son of the promise, saving this for last. Shem was the ancestor of all the sons of Eber. The sons of Shem, Elam, Asher, Arphaxad, Lud, and Aram. The sons of Aram, Uz, Hul, Gether, and Meshech. Uz is, I guess I don't know. I'm thinking of Ur, is where Abraham was in Ur, but you got some of these short one-syllable names. Arphaxad was the father of Shelah, and Shelah the father of Eber. 2 sons were born to Eber. One was named Peleg, because in his time the earth was divided. His brother was Joktan. Joktan the father of Almadad, Shalef, Hazarmaveth, Zerah, Hadaram, Uzal, Dikla, Obal, Abimael, Sheba, Ophir, Havilah, and Jobab.
Good American names.
All these were sons of Joktan.
Busy little guy.
More of those names.
The region where they lived stretched from Mesha towards Safar in the eastern hill country. These are the sons of Shem by their clans and languages, territories, and nations. So these are the clans of Noah's sons according to their lines of descent within their nations. From these, the nations spread out over the earth after the flood.
So what's this division of the earth on here?
The division under Peleg. Yeah. Let's see. Peleg is named here. Perhaps it reflects the fact that at his time the earth was divided with the Tower of Babel. Peleg is simply named here, doesn't elaborate. Moses is going to give his branch of the family fuller treatment in Genesis 11, where he makes it very clear that Peleg's family is the line of succession of the Savior. We often use the term Hebrews and Israelites as synonyms. Taken by themselves, however, Hebrew is broader than Israelite. Aber, meaning to pass over from the Hebrew avar, really means an emigrant. So from the point of view of a Mesopotamian, an Eber would be like a Westerner who had emigrated west across the Euphrates. So in Genesis 14, Abraham is called Abram the Hebrew. Abram the Hebrew. These who emigrated. Israelite would be more narrowly focused out of this. So Abraham is under an umbrella of Hebrews, but part of the Israelites would be more narrowly concentrated, the descendants of Abraham through Isaac and Jacob, who's renamed Israel. Wow.
Yeah.
That's just too much here for me, I'll tell you that.
For you.
We're gonna be tested on the name. Yeah. I hope y'all got it right.
Pick out your favorite. The name of sense.
I understand why it didn't take very long for millions, well,
Yeah.
maybe 900 years, but
Yeah.
I mean, it didn't take long for millions and millions and millions and millions of people.
Well, you wonder, you know,
Genes.
think of these people having different records, having different things like that. And the commentary here points out, do you remember where Moses grew up? Moses grew up in a huge time for the Egyptians under the pharaohs with a library available to him. And he probably learned some of this, and by the Holy Spirit was given a chance to connect these dots and put it in the biblical record. It's pretty amazing. Some of this could even stem from an Egyptian library dating back to Moses' childhood.
So clearly God did not want this lineage, or whatever you want to call it, to be lost.
No.
He wanted a precise record of
Yeah.
everything that was going on.
And
Yes.
it's written in Hebrew, not Egyptian, which is, because it was educated and you can
Yeah.
maintain the Hebrew language.
Well, and you know, our next account, right now we're in Noah's sons, but our next account is going to be the account of Shem. So here we have this is the account of Shem, Ham, and Japheth to start. But once we get through the Tower of Babel and we kind of finish understanding the spread of nations and the differences in language, then we're going to zero back in on the story of the promise with a genealogy that goes and starts with Shem and brings us to Terah and Abram. So Peleg is going to come out in chapter 11, and Eber, the father of Peleg, and Halfar, and some of these other names. Arphaxad is in there, and Shelah. So part of 1024 and 1025 is repeated and embellished in chapter 11 as we redo the account of Shem and move into the story of Abram. Isn't that fun? Just a marvelous record when you think of having such widespread scope to all of this in this account, and then drumming down on this to eventually just sitting in some quiet place where Abram is called by God to leave your people and go to the place I will show you. You know, pack your bags. And he does.
Well, he didn't have anything to do. He couldn't go in the promised land, so he just sit there and go, well, what am I going to do? Well, let's just do some writing here.
Yeah.
Where do you get all the papyrus?
Yeah.
You know, Pastor, I'm way ahead on this, but I just want to bring up something here. Looking at these people as it goes on, you know, he lived 30 years, he lived 34 years, he lived 30 years, 32 years, 30 years, 29 years.
Uh-huh.
I mean, instead of these 2, 3, 4, 5, 600 year living people, all of a sudden it came down to short life.
We're not in the 900s anymore.
Yeah, after the flood, it all
Five
changed.
books of
Yeah, it all changed. I mean,
Yeah.
Some of that
these guys
is-
didn't live very long.
He was that old when they had.
This was when they had their kids.
Son,
Yeah.
but
Yeah,
they were living
sons.
for 100, 200 years.
Kayla, you
They were
lived
still living
209 years.
Yeah.
What's that?
The 34 years, the 30 years, the 32 years is how old they were when they had a son.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, that one.
Yeah, yeah, remember,
Oh, okay.
Merlin, remember this?
Oh,
But
It
then
shows
I-
their
yeah,
age
yeah.
there.
And then on
Okay, I get it. Okay.
But
But
it
it's
was
still
But it
not
says he had
900s.
lived.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, but after Shem, they still didn't live
Yeah.
600, 7, 8, 9.
I get it. I misread that. Yeah, you're right.
They only lived 200.
Well, it's almost
right.
like the longer that list goes, since we're in chapter 11,
Uh,
the longer that list goes, the shorter it
Yeah.
becomes.
Yeah.
Right.
400s down to 200s and 119 so
Well, I guess that's kind of what it meant, but.
Didn't God
good
some-
stock, but getting worse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Didn't God somewhere say that he was shortening the lives?
Yes.
Because then they wouldn't live in sin so long.
Mhm.
Well,
I remember
we did
that.
have,
Time of grace or
that God
something
was
like that.
going to dwindle this time of grace. I wonder if they could kind of sense that, we're not living as long as we used to. And when God mentioned 120 years, that was a timeline for the start of the flood. I'm going to give you 120 years. And then, we have the 70 or 80 years. If we have the strength, Moses writes in a psalm. So by the time you get to Moses, that's what those are his numbers. Now with our advances in medicine and science, you can crack 100 and no sweat.
Some.
Yeah, but they say now we're going backwards. I think
Yeah,
they
we
said
are.
man was could live to 83. Now it's to 82.
Oh,
It's going to the wrong direction.
Michael, take
Yeah.
care of yourself.
I know.
Well, it's quite the.
You're gonna test it pretty soon.
No. I'm gonna see if I can be the exception.
Anybody over 65 is an exception. Worldwide.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You see Elamites, you see some of the circled names that are closer, in Aram before it becomes like, Hittite and Arameans to the north. Sorry for my yawn.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Luddites.
So would that be Syria?
You didn't hear much of Arphaxidites. It just didn't stick.
That was an accident.
Somebody
Oh,
sneezed and they thought they were naming their child.
My husband said, let's name our first child Jehoshaphat.
Yeah.
Oh,
My dad
yeah.
was doing the same thing.
I was joking.
Yeah.
Diane, what were you saying?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Pretty wild to have all this in view before us.
Mogonites. Have you seen them?
Spreading out. So just to reiterate, we had a spiritual story emphasize the differences going on and there before turning them into these ancestors of nations, right? And then taking a look at how they became the ancestors of these nations with sons and names that I guess I erased the tribe, clan, the clan, nation, language idea, but that it's pretty incredible that Moses can put all this in front of us. So you see the world and its population spreading out and changing. The Tower of Babel is going to do another spiritual commentary about that process. Well, should we read that? I don't think I have anything else with chapter 10. So the Tower of Babel in chapter 11, somebody read the whole story for us. I promise there's not too many hard names in there. 1 through 9. 1 through 9. Who wants that? Diane, thank you.
Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As men moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar instead of mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the men were building. The Lord said, "If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other." So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it was called Babel, because the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there, the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth.
Okay. It becomes known as the Tower of Confusion.
Plain of Shinar.
Yeah, if you remember, it's actually listed in here between the rivers. And so mentioning it's close to ancient Babylon, between the Tigris and Euphrates over there.
This event,
Oh, Shinar, okay.
where did it happen? Because earlier they were saying, Shem's descendants, they went out and the other ones went out to all these places and they changed their language. So it seems like this happened first and then
Yeah.
all went out. Do you think it did?
Yeah, I think that this is giving a little bit of a rewind, again, telling us a spiritual story that shows some heavy resistance to the will of God to spread out. That people began to spread out and stopped at a place and wanted to make a name for themselves before continuing on. And that, so it's almost like a little bit of a rewind. I think that's why the translation, because it's not really in the Hebrew. I don't think it's in, I should double check. That it would say now. Yeah, it's a translation aspect to add the word now. And time-wise, we're not really given, time-wise where this fits in, besides the fact that Moses has already listed languages as one of the differentiators, like you're noting. So I think
It was just like the three sons, the only time would be the whole world.
yeah.
And after that, it seemed like then they started.
So early on, I think you would say early on after seeing the Table of Nations, early on in that table, or in that timeline of that table, these people still had one language, and then it was confused and they spread out all the more, becoming what chapter 10 showed them to be.
Did the word Babylon
So-
come from the Tower of Babel?
I don't know. I don't think so. I saw one map. I don't know which one it was or where it was, but I had them side by side, like close to each other.
So
Babylon and Babel.
this might have happened before all these sons spread out. I mean,
Yeah, exactly. Early on in the spreading, while they still had one language, and then
because like Gomer is very close to Mount Ararat. I was thinking maybe went right down there from the mountain,
Yeah.
Started to build
So,
a tower.
yeah.
mhm.
Well, I mean, that's up north of Mount Ararat.
Well, I obviously know that there's enough time for probably a few generations of people to be born, to become populous enough to go get to Shinar and say, let's build a city. We're not really told how big this group is, if it's in the hundreds or the thousands, but it is showing that before these languages were divided and splitting them up even further, like possible with Peleg from chapter 10, verse 25, the earth being divided as a son of Eber. And Eber is one, 2, 3, 4, Shem, Arphaxad, Shelah, Eber, Peleg. So that's what, five, that's at least 4 or 5 generations from Shem. If that was the Great Division, is talking about the Tower of Babel. I think you could see why Moses does the order that he does, because he's getting you off the boat with Shem, Ham, and Japheth. He wants you to see the settling of these peoples under those 3 names, because they are the history of all being sons of Noah. And after doing that, getting back to a spiritual story that explains another driver for their spreading out and the difference in language that happened across the earth. He gives you an explanation in that story. Suzanne?
One of the sons of Shem was Peleg, and in my comment, it says Peleg means division, so maybe it happened from one of the sons of Shem.
Right. It could have happened at least at his time, and named the Great Division when we all split up. Yeah. Patricia.
Keeps talking about the whole earth. Does that mean just there or like the whole world? I mean, people were in the whole earth.
Yeah.
So there were people in the United States.
Well, you could say from there, right? So this is a starting
They
point.
had boats.
Yeah. We know that all the peoples that existed started with their time off that boat. So you've got these 3, and we can say from there. So from there, early on, 5th generation, maybe, you've got these people who then are going to spread out different languages and settle in the places according to the table of the nations and continue an expansion from there.
So there were people in the United States while Jesus was living here.
That's
They say
possible.
so, yeah.
We
They
don't
found
know.
skeletons of people from
Yeah.
I just
But-
never thought, I thought it was just in
Yeah.
that area
Yeah.
that people were.
But I think the people that came to the United States actually came from Asia,
Right.
across into Alaska,
Mhm.
and then down into known as
Because
the
they're more
Native
Asian.
Americans.
Yeah.
a long time.
Okay, so
Yeah.
the original people here were Indians, Native
Mhm.
Americans.
I just had never thought about people being here.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, at
All
that
this was
time,
happening.
Well, they may not have got that far for the whole earth.
I know.
He's saying drawings all over the world, the whole world, the whole earth. Yeah.
Where
And
the
then they
Indians
came
come
from
from.
Asia
Mhm.
through Alaska and the US.
They had to come from there.
what time they reached there, I don't know how quickly they got there, but obviously you could say from there, they began to go out and fill the earth. Where did they stop? Where did they keep exploring and settle new areas? How fast did that take place? It's wild. It's
So
wild.
Columbus, pretty adventurous. I mean, that whole story of Columbus, I don't.
Right. He's obviously not the first one, right?
Yeah.
Well, who did he see when he got here?
Yeah.
You have 2,000
Native Americans.
Pocahontas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Guess I've never thought of that.
Yeah.
before.
Crazy. Anything else there? Obviously you see a technological advance. They're just talking about making bricks. Like, let's forget this whole spread out temporary dwelling thing. They're trying to do it right, long term, bigger, better, and probably doing the wide walled thing, as you maybe know from some of the early Middle Ages. As you're going to make something tall, you have to have a wider base so it can taper. So let's make a bunch of bricks and things where we can count on their shape and the durability of it to build something really tall. And that's what they had begun to do in order to make a name for themselves. So, and the language that was in God's hand to confuse is also then on Pentecost, is the celebration of that great reversal, isn't it? Where God gives languages to these fishermen, has them speak in all these tongues to share the good news on the day of Pentecost. Really neat. All right, well, we'll come back to this. Let's come back and pick it up with the next account, the account of Shem, and we'll go from there. Yeah, Barbara.
In the Sunday school, when you're teaching this lesson in Sunday school, they always compare the pride of the people as they try to make a great tower with God coming down to see the tower is so small.
Yeah.
Come down.
Yeah. Uh,
Oh, yeah, it is.
expression to help us understand it. Hmm. Well, God bless you. We covered a lot of history right there. A lot of years. Let's do it. We'll come back and we'll
flies.
we're gonna zero in on Shem and Abraham to come. So,
What's going on over there right now is it's a lot of bulletins or
yeah,
Yeah.
that's true.
That's a
Right.
comforting way of looking at it. People who are living